Welcome to January 2021. We've survived 2020. So welcome to DevOps for Defense. Today we've got Karen Hirsch from a member of our community for some time now, who's offered to give us a talk on refactoring and code archaeology and how to know if refactoring is right for me. So I really appreciate anytime anyone is interested and willing to contribute. Is always welcome. If anyone ever would like to contribute, please don't hesitate. Shoot an email with your topic. Happy to work with you on getting things put together and making it, getting in the right format and everything for the presentation. As we have always been doing in the virtual setting, we are recording the session and we will post it to our YouTube channel, so be aware of that. If you don't want your voice heard in that form, I just ask you to stay muted during the session. We also will be publishing everything as open source to our repository, so you can not only come back and revisit the topic on YouTube if you desire, you can also see it, the content posted on the repo. So if you'll go to the next chart, Karen.
Apparently.
So as always, we start with our code of conduct. Just remind everybody, this is obviously an unclassified session, so no dirty words. We want to make sure we treat everyone with respect and professionalism. We do want to keep your private information private. Nobody wants to hear your secret sauce, your proprietary work. But we do want to hear about your experiences, what you need, what can help you improve with you and your team in your domain. So share your thoughts and be sure to learn from others and try to help others learn as well as we go through it. And then new in the virtual setting, if you're not speaking, please do stay on mute. It's the dogs barking in the background is usually one that I deal with. Let's respect those who are speaking and just stay on mute while we can. So with that, I'll hand it over to Karen Hirsch to give our presentation. And thank you, Karen, for putting some material together and sharing it with us.
I was glad to do it. I'm going to ask a favor of you, JD. Please unmute yourself and ask me questions if things come up in the chat window. I'm not able to see it and present.
Okay, I will.
And please don't hesitate to interrupt me. I taught high school, I've taught college. I'm used to being interrupted and answering questions on the fly. So this title was just kind of a title. It might as well have been, what did I do on my winter vacation? I keep coming up with kind of the same problem over and over again, but I'm going to start this story on the next slide. This is a picture of me about age 23. I'm actually at a beam cal facility at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. And I've got an experiment that's going to be flying and we're calibrating it down there. And one of the things that I ran into on that program and on my first job at NASA Goddard, I couldn't find a photo from way back then. Apparently photo archaeology is not my strength, was the fact that I often ended up with other people's projects partway built, and they were often very brilliant people who built them. But the labeling was not how I might have labeled it. It might not actually have necessarily corresponded exactly to what I was seeing when I was given the problem. And so this first job of mine had a piece of equipment that had just come back from Cerro Tololo, which is in Chile. It was an astronomical experiment and it was in the infrared. So it was inside a big cask and there was a port on the side of it which had 112 leads in a space about like this. And all of them were orange and 3 of them were broken. And I am 18 years old and the youngest person in the lab. So of course I'm asked, can you go fix this? So, I sat there with my little oscilloscope and my digital multimeter and I figured out, roughly where groups of wires were connected from on the inside because I could open it up. and started using masking tape to kind of separate them out. And we're going to talk about using that type of experience there in code. So while I come from an experimental physics background, that's what my PhD is in. I studied what caused the Northern Lights for my dissertation work. We're going to make use of all of this. You explore something that you think you understand and get a better understanding of where the boundaries are so you can fix the problems. And it was a kind of cool belief I noticed that keeps happening to me career-wise. So what does that story have to do with refactoring? Let's go back to a dictionary definition, or at least a definition of refactoring. I'm going to take it. I read a lot over the break. One of my favorite books was called Refactoring, and it is by Fowler. Another one was Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Feathers. And then I read a whole mess of blogs because I had free time before the kid woke up. She's 13 and she's finally learned to sleep in. So the noun definition is going to have to do with a change that's going to be inside the code that's not going to affect the observable behavior. And ideally, we're only going to do this if it's going to make it cheaper to fix the code, to modify the code, to change the code a bit. But whatever we're going to do, it's going to be to the internal structure without modifying its observable behavior. And then the verb is the actual action of doing that work. So restructuring the software. It's a regressive definition there by applying a series of refactorings without changing its observable behavior. And
so Karen, at some point, is it safe to say that this is addressing technical debt in your baseline to some extent?
Absolutely, you can use it for technical debt, of course, but the other place you end up coming across this all the time is you've got a perfectly well-functioning code that's been production for a while, and you suddenly find something different. I'll give an example. I was playing around with Modtran over the holiday. Modtran is an atmospheric code. It's written, not surprisingly, with the ending tran in Fortran. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to talk about refactoring, I probably ought to do some refactoring. So I invented an atmospheric constituent. And I thought about, well, where does that need to end up in the code to affect how, one of the things Modtran does is it lets you know what you're looking through in the atmosphere. So if you are an astronomer sitting on the ground and looking up, you now know what's your background, so you can subtract it out of whatever wavelengths you're looking at. So I invented something that was going to change what that background looked like, and I wanted to figure out where it would propagate through. And Modtran is old enough that you use input decks when you talk about what. Okay, so it's a nice sized legacy code. We're a good amount of slop. Very well written. I could figure out exactly where I was going to go in it. It, of course, does not come with any tests, because for code archaeology, oftentimes you don't have the initial requirements. You don't necessarily have any sets of tests. And I know we're in a DevOps for defense group, but I'll bet you've run across some of these. I know I have. I spent a decade at Los Alamos National Labs, and there were things that were lingering from the 50s. And I guarantee you some of those codes did not have what we would want for, no JUnit tests there. I am sure some of you have seen that someplace in your career.
Or the test that was just done recently is a Word document with a series of steps rather than something executable.
Yeah, or maybe you're looking at one set of data and trying to match it, and you're using a visual. Maybe the original way you were doing it was on acetate and you were overlaying them. Those are always keen too. But yeah, so I put up here a graphic that kind of points to the fact that there is a turnover part where, you know, you've got a spaghetti code, often it's a monolith, and there's some place where it's more cost effective to go in and change it than it is to try and just just kind of strong arm a new feature in. So going back to refactor, you probably are not going to refactor a million slok, right? Not all the way through, not all at once. That's a lot. So I like stealing cartoons for evening meetings. So I stole this one out of a blog I found. I told you I read a lot of blogs. But here are the reasons that you might be going to some legacy code, whether it's a production code or one that had been mothballed. You might want to be adding a feature or capability. You may have discovered a bug and you'll want to fix that. There may be a reason to improve that design. And then, you know, sometimes technology has changed and you're not running on the same kind of system that you used to run on. So you may want to optimize resource usage and loads. And I'm going to come back to this. We're never going to perfect this product theme over and over again tonight. And the reason I'm going to come back to it is because I am OCD enough to want to do it right. And many software developers, I think, are also in that same boat where they want to do it right. And we all know that when we pull open those codes that have been around for a while and maybe were written in, you know, Fortran or COBOL or Ada or whatever, they're big, they're messy, and they kind of feel archaic to us. And while everyone on this call is smart enough to be able to dig in there and kind of start ferreting around, we all know we would do it better and differently today. And it's tempting to just wipe it away and go start over. And I'm going to argue that oftentimes that's not the right way to go. So it's time to refactor when the cost of code archaeology to figure out when and how to change the code is higher than the cost of cleaning it up. So the other real glaringly obvious time that you want to refactor is when the current logic isn't going to support the new features you need. So if you had, you know, an if statement and now you've got 3 choices and you're going to have nested loops, maybe there's a case statement or something else you can go at, or maybe you can handle, the other place I saw a lot of this was simplifying functions. And
So Karen, there's an element of estimation that comes into play here when you're forecasting what it would cost to make the change versus clean it up. I think that puts some uncertainty in the calculus here as you go through it. And I find because we're contract work and we have, you know, program managers who generally non-technical, they just see it as hours not making progress on their commitment.
And it gets worse, of course, if you somehow decrease the line of the slot count while you're in the process of refactoring. If you find something really clever that both cleans it up and makes it shorter, now you've actually lost work, right? That's like negative.
Can I tell us a funny story, Karen? I hate to interrupt your talk, but I think it's relevant to what you just said. So I was working an Air Force program for range safety many moons ago. Turns out the East Coast and the West Coast ranges are like the Crips and Bloods. They hate each other with passion. And so we built this system. We delivered, you know, the Mark I version. And it was dramatically better than the water-cooled VAX that they'd been using for 40 years. But they obviously had some additional needs. We got some great feedback and we were able to incorporate that. And, you know, 6 months later, we delivered the Mark II version of the system. Everybody loved it. They were happy. It did what they needed. The West Coast people didn't see the East Coast people stuff and vice versa. So that meant it was much better. But what was curious is we did a lot of refactoring and a lot of performance optimization as we went through that Mark II release. And we reduced the slok by about 40% from Mark I to Mark II. And when the Air Force received our metrics, they were irate. They were absolutely pissed off. And they said we had stole their slok and they wanted money back. And so you got to be careful, you know, in these contexts of making sure people understand what you're doing and what the outcomes are and what's really important and how you measure things and all that. Or you'll get people who just pull, you know, standard, you know,
We have the wrong
BS
metric,
metrics.
right? And that's
Yeah, pull these BS metrics and try to make decisions around them.
just because you can measure something doesn't mean it's a value added metric. Yeah, I could talk about that one all day.
Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. I
No,
thought that
it's a
little
very
story was
valid,
relevant.
amusing story. And this is where I have been stuck over and over again. So I am old enough. I've been in this field since 1989. So there was a time when I did not write automated tests. The V&V team would go and verify my code did what it was supposed to do. And that was normal, right? I mean, even up to CMMI level 1, that was pretty normal. We didn't have necessarily an IDE that was particularly good. We didn't have a lot of static code analysis at the time. That's just how we did it. And so a lot of these legacy codes, they don't have the automated tests, and I'm afraid to go touch even my own code from 20 years ago without having something that can tell me, have I actually changed the behavior or haven't I? So whatever it is I'm touching, that little piece of it that I'm thinking I'm going to refactor, because again, most of these are, you know, million line of slok or whatever. Whatever little piece I'm touching, I need to find some edges so I can set some automated tests just for what I'm looking at. And the way Feathers described it, he said most programmers still are using edit and pray rather than cover and modify in how they talk about code. And we don't want to be in the edit and pray world. That's very expensive, right? I mean, that's the whole reason we're in a DevOps group, is to try and learn best practices. It's incredibly expensive not to get feedback until you're all the way at delivery, or all the way to, I've handed it off to V&V, it's their problem now. Especially if we're doing refactoring a little at a time using DevSecOps practices, we really need cover and modify. And that's where I started struggling as I started reading more and more over the break, was how do I find those break points? It's really obvious in a non-monolithic code. You know, you're in a subroutine, or you're in a function, or you're in whatever, remembering we're still back in Fortran land or COBOL or whatever. But if it's a huge monolith, finding those places where you can put those automated tests are going to be part of the expense of your code archaeology. So, you know, we're going to need both unit tests and behavioral tests. And Reddit, of course, comes to the rescue for something funny about testing. So you're first going to need to find where it is you think you're going to be changing something in the first place. And then you're going to have to find a place where you can test things. And then you need to break any dependencies so you can just run your test over and over again. If it took an hour, 40 minutes to compile in your Ada compiler, or 25 minutes in your Fortran compiler, you don't want to compile the whole thing. You just want to compile what you're working on right now. Because again, if we're in a DevSecOps type environment, you need that feedback and you need it to be fast. And then you can write the tests. And once you've written those tests, then we can go on and start to actually do the refactoring, which was the whole point in the first place. But in the process, we've already done the archaeological explore on the code. Now, here's where I'm in trouble. It's tempting to do it right, and it's tempting to do it all, and it's tempting to do it all right now. but we're not trying to do that. We really, really want those codes to cover all, those tests to cover only the code we're likely to be changing right now. And what that means, by the way, is you can be doing refactoring and be done with refactoring, and you've still got a teeny tiny percentage of your code covered with automated tests. And you have to convince yourself that that's okay. So rather than thinking in the way that I want to think with my DevSecOps mind, what I would like you to do is remember kind of the Boy Scout philosophy of going camping. And the whole point of your code archaeology definition, and I've also heard it called code spelunking in the literature, is that you want to leave it better than you found it. You want to leave clues for the people who are going to come after you and do their own code archaeology. And you want to leave tests in place that can actually help the developers that come after you. But you don't need to leave it perfect. Okay, so once you've got that test added, you need to start on your refactoring. And there are a bunch of different things that you can do for refactoring. And there's a quick list in the back of the refactoring book. I've mentioned this book once already tonight, and it'll be on the last slide as well, that talks about all the different types of really, quick ways to get into the code, and the smells you're going to look at and how to clean it up. But some of them have to do with preparatory or comprehension. You got in there and it was just so confusing, and you would just like to be able to follow that variable. And that variable is something obvious like temperature, and it's called, I don't know, lowercase t, which has some ambiguity with time. So we're going to call it temperature in today's world, or we're going to call it something where it's not going to have that ambiguity. You might be doing this also for comprehension. And then sometimes you're just going to be in there and there's something that annoys you, but you're in there already and it doesn't cost very much. And that we'll call opportunistic refactoring. And so, any place where you might make your interfaces simpler. Especially when you're working with a legacy code and you might be attaching it to something that's newer, right? If you're not going to put it back in Fortran or Ada or COBOL, you may have a way to rethink interfaces and rethink about how you're storing data between modules that may make sense. Cleaning up that data and simplifying it. If you can do that, any place you've got duplicated code, and we used to do it all the time, right? You had something that could calculate, I don't know, a coordinate system for you, and that's now in your legacy code, like 25 different times you're going to do this coordinate transformation. Doesn't need to be there. We can now do that in a different way. You can have a function that does that. And then simpler functions to aid future code archaeologists. And this is just a short list from the books that I was reading, but it helps me at least start thinking about what I'm not there to do as well, because there's a bunch that's not on that list. I'm not going to start from scratch. I am going to kind of keep notes on what I'm doing so somebody else can follow along. I'll probably do that in Confluence with, if I'm fixing a bug or if I'm adding a functionality with the JIRA attached, or, I'm not saying don't do that, but I am saying we're not going to do everything. And this is my last slide. There are lots of answers out there. I had some blog posts pulled up if people push me in that direction, but this was really all I did over my winter break was think about this stuff because it kept coming up at work and I was tired of not having any answers and wanting to do the wrong thing. So thank you all.
Thank you, Karen. A couple of comments I'll make from my massive failures in attempted refactoring. One I think is worth pointing out is having good configuration management's absolutely critical.
Absolutely.
And if you start a refactoring activity and you're on your trunk, you're probably in for a really bad time.
Oh yeah.
So I found always create a branch and start your refactoring in the branch. And I also found you always want to commit frequently. Try to make small changes as you're refactoring and then
Yeah.
commit and test, or test and commit better. But you can, I have gone down paths where I thought I had brilliant, improvement ideas, only to spend a week realizing that I've drove myself down a dead end, and recovery was atrocious to say the least. So, have a good safety net and good CM as you're going down to a
Absolutely.
refactoring
Always,
activity.
always, but especially here.
Yeah.
It's like rebuilding the Cathedral of Notre Dame or something without a safety net. Just
Yeah. The other thing that I find interesting is sometimes people are premature in their optimization.
oh yeah.
You're good. And so they'll put all these design patterns in place thinking, oh, maybe one day I will, when instead they should realize they can always refactor to incorporate a given design pattern when the need arises. Reduce the complexity of your code base, simplify its maintainability and its readability. So I think I'm making the statement I have seen, and I've probably been guilty of, certainly premature optimization, um, but almost pre-factoring, if you know what I mean.
I do know what
Um,
you mean. And I've seen it also on the system engineering side where people like over architect the system,
mhm.
and now you're trapped with all this extra stuff that's not going anywhere. And
Yeah,
now go back and do that code archaeology, and that's terrifying.
yeah, it's rough. So always remember you can always go and refactor later, get the attributes that you're looking for, and keep things simple. So Karen, again, thank you so much for sharing your holiday professional development with us and what you've learned. I, I think this is number one. Anything by Fowler is always good, to build on and learn. For those of you who don't know Martin Fowler, I would really encourage you to go look at some of his writing. It's really transformative. And he's, of course, one of the signatories on the Agile Manifesto. So he's got a lot of great stuff out there, from refactoring to microservices. The guy kind of invented these things, the strangler pattern, all these things. Really great body of material, to
A
build
lot of
on
it
and
for free
apply.
on his blog too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Don't even need to go and buy books unless that's your thing, man.
So I think that's it for this month's session. Thank you all for joining us. We'll stick around and have a little bit of discussion, but we'll call it a meetup for this month. We'll have a something set up for next month as well.